Prepare to plus.
Well, who could forget the Blue Jays' final game 5 against the Texas Rangers? What a night, it'll never be forgotten. Fabulous game, full house, completely sold out. People are like killing for a seat. They spend thousands of dollars to get a seat, completely sold out. The Bernsteins have seats, they go to the game, they settle in, game starts. About halfway through the first inning, they notice behind them there's an empty seat. Well, it's driving them crazy. The curiosity is overwhelming, and finally she turns behind, and Mrs. Bernstein says to the woman, "What's with the empty seat? Do you know whose seat that is and why it's empty?" The lady behind says, "Yes, that's the seat of my late husband." "Oh, I'm sorry," Mrs. Bernstein says. I didn't mean to offend you. I'm very sorry. Please, I apologize." You sit back and watch the game. By the 5th inning, Mrs. Bernstein's mind is just going crazy. She has to ask the question. She turns to the lady behind and says, "Excuse me, I don't mean to be rude. I don't mean to embarrass you, but I'm thinking it's such an important game. The seats are so valuable and such excitement here. Don't you have a family member or a friend who you could have invited to be with you?" And she says, "I have plenty, but they're all at the funeral."
The goose waddles into a drugstore. And he waddles up to the counter and he says to the clerk, "I'd like to buy a condom." And the clerk says, "Just a second, I'm going to get the pharmacist." And the pharmacist comes over. The goose says, "I'd like to buy a condom." The pharmacist says, "Certainly, no problem." He goes to get the condom, puts it back, and he says to the goose, "Shall I put it on your bill?" And the goose says, "I am not that kind of goose."
A very young and very, very naive couple, Orthodox couple, had an arranged marriage, and after the wedding, they found themselves in their bridal suite. The young bride got out of her gown and she got into bed. Her husband stood in the middle of the room, and he stood there and he said, "I don't know what to do." She said, "Well, I think I can help you. First, take off your strommel." So he takes off this big black fur hat. And then she says, "Well, now take off your capote." So he takes off his long black satin coat. She says, "Now take off your tzitzis." He does. And she says, "Now get out of your clothes and come into bed and lie on top of me." So he does that, and he says, "What do I do now?" She says, "Now you're dovin'."
A woman goes into the doctor's office, and the doctor notices she's a little depressed. And he says, "What's going on?" And she goes, "Oh, doctor, my husband's no longer interested in sex. He's no longer amorous. He's no longer passionate." And the doctor says, "We can do something for that. I can give you some stuff." So she takes the vial, they're eating dinner, and she manages to slip it into his food. Well, all of a sudden he becomes so amorous, so passionate, he screws her on the table. He screws her under the table. He screws her on the table. It's great. Unfortunately, he brought some of the china, but it was fabulous. Next day, she goes into the doctor's office, big smile on her face. And the doctor says, "So well?" She goes, "Oh, doctor, just like you said, I managed to slip it into his food, and he became so amorous, so passionate, he screwed me on the table. He screwed me under the table. He screwed me on the table. Unfortunately, we broke some of the china." And the doctor says, "I feel a little responsible. Let me pay for part of the china." And the woman says, "No, doctor, don't worry. We're never going back to that restaurant again."
I asked my wife, "What's better for old Jewish men, boxers or briefs?" She said, "Depends."
So a police officer stops a guy that's speeding. He says, "What's your name?" Speeder says, "Fred." He says, "What kind of name's Fred?" He says, "Well, I used to be known as Fred Johnson. So a long time ago I became a doctor, and I was Fred Johnson, MD. Then I got bored with medicine, went into dentistry. I became Fred Johnson, MD, DDS. Then I started to fool around with my assistant, and she gave me VD. I was Fred Johnson, MD, DDS with VD. Then the Dental Association heard I had VD. They took away the DDS. I was Fred Johnson, MD with VD. Then the Medical Association took away the MD because they heard I had VD. Then I was Fred Johnson with VD. Then the VD took away my Johnson. Now I'm just Fred.
So did you hear about the Pope's recent trip that he took to Los Angeles? Well, let me tell you, he landed in Los Angeles, and at the end of the trip, he turned to his driver and said, I've always wanted to see Las Vegas, and we're so close, let's go. So they hop in the car, and about halfway along the trip, the Pope tells the driver to stop and says, get out of the car. He says, the real reason that I wanted to go to Vegas is not to go to Vegas, but these are desert roads, and I've always wanted to drive the POPEMOBILE. The driver says, I don't think this is a good idea. He says, I'm the boss, you get in the back, and I'll drive. So the driver gets in the back, the Pope starts driving, puts his foot on the floor, 100 kilometers an hour, 150, 200, 250. All of a sudden, the sirens start wailing. The police pull over the Pope. They see him in the car. The officer takes his microphone, he steps away from the car, and he calls his chief. He says, Chief, I think I've stopped somebody really important. He says, who is it? Is it a congressman? He says, no, I think he's more important than a congressman. Is it a senator? He says, no, I think it's more important than a senator. He says, is it the President of the United States? He says, no. He says, well, who could be more important than the President of the United States? He says, I don't know, but his driver's the Pope.
So Morris goes to House of Ill Repute, and he says to the Madame, do you have any girls here that know how to do it the Jewish way? And the Madame looks at all the ladies standing around the wall and says, any of you know how to do it the Jewish way? So one pretty young lady says, you know what, I'll look after Mr. Greenberg. She takes Mr. Greenberg by the arm, chauffeurs him off to her room, locks the door, she gets undressed, he gets undressed, and then she looks at him, she says, you know, Mr. Greenberg, I have a confession to make. I really don't know what the Jewish way is, but I'll tell you what, if you tell me what the Jewish way is, or better still, if you show me what the Jewish way is, I'll do it for you for half price. He says, that's the Jewish way?
It was a cold and miserable and stormy night, and Moshe Nebuch was laying on his deathbed, and he knew the time was coming. And he called his beloved wife Esther over to the bed and said, Esther, we need to call the priest. And Esther was stunned and said, Moshe, bist Meshige geworden? You've gone crazy? We don't need a priest. We need the rabbi. And Moshe sits back and says, oh, Esther, on such a miserable night, you want to call the rabbi out?
Dave Keystone, single. Just in case you put that in as an outtake.